Hello, Brobs. We're back with So the Witch Won't Eat Me. Alright, now we can read it. The witch has cursed me, apparently. I think we got more coming. Told you I'm not Kelsey Grammer. So the Witch Won't Eat Me, Chapter 3. 4 children who insisted they belonged to the opposite sex. At a time of so much confusion to many quarters concerning the origin and the meaning of homosexuality, I found it increasingly illuminating to turn to my experience with 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls who were referred to me because they insisted they belonged to the opposite sex. Although homosexual feelings are universal, the persistent acting out of the fantasy and an assumed sexual identity appears to occur only under specific circumstances. That the dynamics are similar to those from which other defensive fantasies spring became clear to me when I explored the backgrounds of these 4 children. As I had found in Larry's case, in each instance, the child had commenced acting out the fantasy when a specific incident jeopardized his already precarious situation and convinced him that his life was endangered. That these children did not select Mighty Mouse or Superman or any other powerful identity, but chose an opposite sexual identity appeared to be determined by a very particular and remarkably similar constellation of factors. In all instances, they had been exposed to the actual violence of one parent, so that they had to defend themselves not merely against the fear, but against the threat of infanticide. In addition, the only refuge offered by the other parent against the danger was at most detachment and a seductive facade. The factors that appeared to determine the choice of a sexual fantasy, however, were related in all instances to the children's perception of the character of their parents' relationship. In all cases, they were convinced by the feelings and the behavior of the parents either toward each other or toward them that the parents did not love each other, and that the parent of the opposite sex preferred them. They therefore ascribed the other parent's violent, rejecting character to jealousy and experienced themselves as the target of that parent's jealous retaliation. The children consequently concluded that the only way they could save their lives was to change their sex. By creating the fantasy that they really belonged to the sex that they felt was preferred by the threatening parent, they hoped not only to allay that parent's jealous fears, but to transform violence into love. The acted-out fantasy of a sexual reversal thus provided a refuge against the fear of being killed by supplying a framework within which it was possible to maintain the hope of eventually being loved. With all 4 children, it was possible to establish the event that created the immediate need for an acted-out opposite sexual identity. Although each child had found other means until then to protect himself against the parents' violence, the new and more formidable development rendered them ineffectual and required a more drastic defense. In 3 instances, the birth of a sibling of the opposite sex or of one who resembled the parent of the opposite sex precipitated the acting out of the fantasy of a homosexual identity. In the 4th, it was the seductive exposure to the parent of the opposite sex that further jeopardized already perilous relationships with the violent familial members of the same sex. Although homosexuality generally implies the satisfaction of instinctual needs by a partner of the same sex, the cases of these 4 children indicate that the actual transformation of sexual identity may occur well before the development of such needs. Perhaps a good part of the confusion that has surrounded the understanding of homosexuality stems from the concentration on physical behavior in relation to the sexual partner and the variety of its expression. When approached from the vantage point of childhood, however, the problem is remarkably simplified, since the maturational level of the child usually precludes a need for instinctual gratification. Physical acting out of sexual feelings has little relevance. It is nevertheless clear that the child has developed a homosexual defense and that its essential feature is the persistent acting out of a sexual reversal. With all 4 children, the acting out was well established but corresponded to their developmental stage and limited itself to assertion, appearance, and mannerism. Since in most instances psychoanalytic treatment resolves the child's need to adopt an opposite sexual identity, we can only conjecture that without it, sexual maturation would also require sexual expression. The seemingly bewildering symptomatology of homosexuality takes on a new meaning as soon as we recognize that the issue is frequently one of life or death. Any doubt about the function of the homosexual acting out may be clarified by Freud's explanation. The greater the resistance, the more extensively will expressing and acting repetition be substituted for recollecting. Perhaps in no other fantasy in the scale of the repression so formidable. Perhaps in no other fantasy is the scale of the repression so formidable. In the case of one adult patient, every experiencing of a forbidden feeling was followed by panic and the compulsion for homosexual contact. Frequently, however, the dimensions of the homosexual's resistance to recollecting are not adequately accommodated merely by the acting out. The denial and the acted out fantasy of a homosexual identity is as striking as the repression that it serves. The homosexual's frequent insistence that his fantasy is real, that he actually does belong to the opposite sex or a third sex, that he is simply fulfilling his true nature, or that he was born that way, is unquestionably a symptom in the service of his resistance to recollecting, and may suggest both the unbearable dimensions of his memories of terror and his conviction that his life depends on preserving his assumed identity. His only hope of love and thus of safety appears to be sustained by it, because there is a wide range of dynamics that may also result in the persistent acting out of homosexual identity. I shall confine my discussion to those I discovered in my treatment of the 4 children. Nevertheless, the unwavering intensity of the simple assertions of these children that they belonged to the opposite sex and the familial conditions that necessitated it have provided a reliable frame of reference in my effort to unravel the added complexities of similar phenomena at a later age. In 3 of these cases, I shall limit myself to an examination of the dynamics. In the 4th, the actual psychological transformation from homosexual fantasy to homosexual identity, and its dynamics are so clear that I shall present it at some length. Rose was brought to see me at the age of 4 because her aggressive, provocative behavior had caused her expulsion from nursery school for the second time in little over a year, and boded ill for the future. She insisted she was a boy, refused to wear dresses, and played only with boys. She also bit and threw things, took over children's toys, and was generally uncontrollable. The mother dated her insistence on a sexual reversal from the age of 2 when her brother was born. Although the mother described the weaning process at 3 months as no problem, Rose immediately after developed a colic condition that lasted until she was 2. Exactly coincidental with that period, she also fainted whenever she received injections in the doctor's office. When she cried and when she fell and hurt herself, both conditions disappeared at the time of her brother's birth, but were immediately replaced by her adoption of an opposite sexual identity. Rose's parents, a very good-looking couple in their late 20s called Bobby and Robbie, there you go, there's the problem, arrived for their first interview in identical sports attire. Although there was nothing masculine in the mother's manner, her clothes were clearly designed to correspond to her husband's. He seemed the more dominant of the two and appeared as aggressive and energetic as she seemed passive and detached. Their main interest was sports, and they devoted their leisure time, mainly Sunday, to its pursuit. The mother stated that Rose's birth had been planned and that she loved children. The father concurred in this feeling, but confessed that before Rose's birth he had been set on her being a boy. After the initial disappointment, however, he enjoyed her just as much, treated her no differently, and had already inducted her into the realm of sports. He became so fond of her, in fact, that he was not particularly eager to have a boy when his son was born. Since the birth of a third child, a girl, 3 months before, Rose had shared her room with her brother, but she had always been a poor sleeper and invariably came into her father's bed at 3 or 4 in the morning and finished the night with him. She actually saw little of him in her waking hours since he was home only on Saturdays, her contact being mainly a few minutes each morning and again at bedtime each evening. He was very strict with her and resorted to spanking as a way of dealing with problems. Her relationship with her mother was easier. Rose's conflict was revealed dramatically during her first session when she took up her position in the public corridor outside my door, insisting she preferred it to my office. The elevator man who happened by was charmed by her appearance and innocently exclaimed, "What a pretty little girl." She was immediately transformed into a pugnacious demon as she hurled back at him the most scathing epithet she could command. "I'm not a little girl, you kid." Several sessions later, seated on my couch, she confided with inexpressible pleasure, "I have a penis and it's inside and it's a secret." All right. Rose's development suggests that just before the age of 2, she had faced a crisis created by the imminent birth of a sibling that was then exacerbated by the fact of his sex. Her fainting, which commenced at 4 months, had no organic cause, according to her physician, who explained it as a temper tantrum. It was possibly a response to terror, however, a hypothesis suggested by its occurrence following fear-instilling incidents. Although we don't know how the father's initial disappointment expressed itself, we are aware that he habitually used spanking as a means of punishment, and according to the mother, was very strict, except with sports. There is reason to believe, however, that Rose experienced both her father and her mother as sources of danger. From what we know of the effect on the child of a seductive relationship with the parent of the opposite sex, we can safely conjecture that her father's acceptance of her as a sleeping partner cast her mother in the role of a vengeful rival. It seemed maybe like a leap, but nevertheless he was molesting her. Nevertheless, of the two parents, the mother was clearly the more protective and more accepting. Her passivity and detachment offered some refuge and possibly came closest to Rose's experience of love, the imminent birth of a sibling, particularly of a male who would gratify his father's wishes, therefore threatened Rose not only with complete abandonment on his part, and in Rose's terms, possibly death, but even, what's all this death? But even more, the loss of whatever protection her hope of her mother's love offered. Her previous somatic defenses were rendered ineffectual. In what may have been a desperate attempt, therefore, to save her life by winning love, Rose insisted that she herself was a boy. The dynamics, which had to be arrived at partly by conjecture in Rose's case, emerged more clearly in the case of Richard. He was referred to me because at the age of 6, his insistence that he was a girl, which had started a year and a half before, was becoming unendurable. Had reached such proportions that life for him and his family was becoming unendurable. Pardon. At school, his preference for female attire and for playing with the girls and their dolls, his concentration on the female figure in his drawings, and his refusal to get undressed in public for swimming or gym made him the center of ridicule. At home, he dressed in his mother's clothes, used her cosmetics at every opportunity, and stood in front of the mirror endlessly admiring his reflection. Pardon as I scratched my eye. Since he didn't play well with other children, he was his mother's constant companion and concern. His resentment of his 13-month-old brother was another source of difficulty. He particularly objected to the injustice of the fate that had allowed his brother to have the same brown eyes and dark hair as his mother, that is, in his words, to be a girl, whereas he looked like his father and was therefore ugly. Possibly to deny this resemblance, he fluttered his eyes when he talked, moved his body in an unmistakable imitation of a female manner, and endowed his speech with a rhythm and inflection that he presumably borrowed from women. At 6, he was as convincing a male homosexual as his age allowed. Richard's father was engaged in computer research, but suffered from such severe depressions. He must have been a Giants or Jets fan, that recently he had scarcely been able to function. He had made one suicide attempt and had required hospitalization just a year prior to Richard's referral. Several times during the period of Richard's treatment, he appeared again to be close to breaking down. He was extremely withdrawn the few times I saw him and gave the impression of a man whose energy seemed concentrated on keeping feelings as far removed and as safe as possible. He had been totally uninterested in Richard's birth and ignored him during the first year of his life. Oh, wait, I'm confusing the boy with the girl. Pardon. By the time Richard entered treatment, his father's contact with him consisted and his lying next to him for a few minutes at Richard's bedtime, and dutifully taking him on an occasional outing. Whenever he became aware of Richard's feminine proclivities, however, he exploded in rage. He also felt enormously guilty for his neglect of Richard and hopeless about ever changing. Richard's mother was a small, good-looking, but passive woman who remained sympathetic but detached during the year and a half I knew her. Richard's perception of his partner's relationship had led him to conclude that he was his mother's preferred companion, a concept that expressed itself in fantasies of dating movie actresses. Pretty sure that's normal. On his Rorschach, Richard revealed that he was afraid of a madman who hides bombs in buildings, and he responded to the mother card, which usually elicits a human or animal response, as a sunsuit or a dress. Although the father was openly rejecting and violent from Richard's birth and his mother equally detached, it was from age 4.5 that his mother dated. His insistence that he was a girl, his adoption of feminine mannerisms, and an interest in feminine clothes and activities. At the time, she was 3 months pregnant. As shadowy and shell-like as the sunsuit or dress image of his mother apparently was, as in the case of Rose, she was his only source of protection, as well as his only experience of love. Faced with that loss at the imminent birth of a new sibling, and, as he undoubtedly perceived it, abandoned to his father's murderous violence, he resorted to the only solution that could save his life, to be a girl. Once the baby was born, he also very possibly correctly perceived that his father's rejection of him was partly due to his son's resemblance to him, and his easier acceptance of his baby brother to the baby's resemblance to the mother, that is, to his being a girl. Richard's homosexual defense was obviously designed to protect him against the threat of being killed in an atmosphere that was charged with violence and insufficiently invested with genuine loving feelings. He was unfortunately removed from treatment when his father, emerging from a deep depression, suddenly realized that his son was being treated by a lay analyst, but not before Richard had triumphantly announced at the beginning of one session, "I know you won't believe me, but I'm joining the Cub Scouts." Lorna, being a girl, was at the opposite end of the spectrum. Her only recourse was to be a boy. Her switch in sexual identity also occurred at the same age as Richard's, and also around the birth of a sibling. This one also a boy. The dynamics in Lorna's case, however, were somewhat more complex. Both parents were violent and engaged in physical combat. The father, however, used violence only against the mother. Although the mother never initiated violence against the father and merely defended herself, she used violence against Lorna. In addition, Lorna was caught in a psychological bind that robbed her further of any sense of safety. The father, a successful accountant who had married for the second time, had another child by his first wife. Although he was extremely self-absorbed and immersed himself in work to the exclusion of almost any other interest, he had assumed the authoritative role in relation to Lorna's care from her birth, constantly disparaging the mother and contradicting and correcting her handling of the baby. This continued as the baby emerged from infancy into childhood and assumed the character of an alliance against the mother. In addition, Lorna's needs and wishes became the father's commands, whereas the mother's were ignored. This elevation of the child's importance enraged the mother and filled the child with terror at the threat of her mother's retaliation. Since she actually saw little of her father, Lorna was caught between his seductiveness and neglect and her mother's greater care and rage. Of the two, the mother was apparently more reliable, although terrifying. With the birth of a brother who escaped Lorna's fate and held little interest for the father, Lorna had to contend with a sibling whom the mother felt free to enjoy. To the terror of her father's seduction, I don't get this seduction part, and apparent preference and her mother's violent rejection and rivalry, was now added the evidence that being a boy not only provided greater protection, but even invoked love. At that point, all safety was undermined, and a masculine identity became the only solution. When we turn to the case of 5.5-year-old Danny, the relationship between suicidal fantasies and an opposite sexual identity emerges with some clarity. In that connection, there comes to mind the comment of one patient when suicidal wishes had come to the fore. At that point, she stated, "For someone like me, homosexuality is in the luxury class. Staying alive is the issue." Initially, Danny's fantasies defended him against suicide and the threat of being killed. Only as these preoccupations subsided did his secret fantasy of reverse sexual identity begin to emerge. The actual acting out of an opposite identity was then precipitated by a seductive exposure to his mother. This also yielded in response to an improved life situation, but returned when extraordinary circumstances once more required it. Although he was referred to me by his protesting parents because his kindergarten teacher felt that he was too immature to advance to first grade, it soon became clear that Danny was engaged in a life or death struggle. He himself could see only one end for it all: death by violence, whether by his own hand or another's, seemed immaterial. His brother Joe, 5 years his senior, and as big and bulky as Danny was diminutive, was a major source of his problem. Joe was a friendless and withdrawn boy who had clearly not welcomed Danny's birth. When Danny was old enough to play games with Joe organized a class consisting of the cat, Jocko the monkey, Bozo the clown, and Danny. Unhappily for Danny, the star pupil was the cat, as her consistently higher grades demonstrated. This early school experience, get back on their jacket, and Joe's constant reference to him as a dope undoubtedly played their role in convincing Danny by the time he entered treatment that very new experience was simply another opportunity for failure. In addition, Joe passed his door every night after Danny had fallen asleep and called in until he woke him up. He also confided to Danny periodically that he wanted him to die. I want that itch on my nose to die. He says he'd like me to be killed, Danny related sometime later, but I don't believe it. He'd really be sorry and cry over my grave. Nevertheless, Danny disclosed, "That night I think that someone is coming in the room to stab me. Not Joe, someone from the alley. I can't think who, maybe a monster." Monsters were a regular part of Danny's waking and sleeping life. He saw them on TV every day. Someone took a picture of a ghost, he informed me. Barbara saw it. When people die against their wishes, they return as a ghost. In reality, Danny's difficulty in identifying the monster may have stemmed from the fact that he had two choices. At another time, he described the image of his father with a knife in his hand. When Danny was tested prior to entering treatment, his feelings of hopelessness were revealed in his response to one of the pictures on the children's apperception test, a baby. He stated, "One night was sleeping in the crib and a robber smashed the window. Mother and father came in and the father said, 'I'm going after the robber.' They took the baby to the hospital, but they couldn't make him better. They had to bury him. They were sad, and that's the end of the story." The role of the parents in this tale, I thought these fucking cases were supposed to be confidential. The role of the parents in this tale was a very accurate presentation of what occurred in reality. "I'm going after the robber," the father said, but there was no indication of action. As Danny reported, he repeatedly complained about Joe, but his parents never did anything. The parents' failure to protect Danny from his brother's murderous wishes was only one facet in a way of relating that produced in him an expectation and desire for death. He clearly felt, as he indicated in another test response, that his parents shared Joe's wishes. In a long story about a mother and father monkey who are telling secrets while the baby is with the grandmother, he stated, "They don't like the others, and they're making a plan. They get a rifle and they kill the others. They don't like the baby and the grandmother." Although his parents contributed in different ways to Danny's tentative hold on life, they both found it unnecessary to inform him about any plans that they had for him, and they had both apparently felt it appropriate to keep him in a crib until he entered treatment. "My father's going to screw my new bed together tonight," Danny announced exuberantly during one session. "That crib was too small. It made me feel like a baby. I kept telling my parents, but all they said was soon, soon." That's the closest Danny came to criticizing his parents for several years. At another time, referring to a classmate whom he generally accepted as his authority, he did so merely by innuendo. Ronnie says he liked his mother better, he announced one day with unconcealed surprise. All right, that's all I'm reading. I gotta go to work. Goodbye, Barbara. Goodbye. Goodbye.